to another episode of the On the Water podcast. I'm Jimmy Fee. I've got Kevin Blinkoff here, and I can still smell the Albie slime upon my hands.
I smell it too. It's pungent.
It's a wonderful smell. It's the smell of the beginning of the fall run. Kevin and I were out in our kayaks just this morning. It is the Thursday before Labor Day weekend. You'll hear this in a couple days. And we got our first Albies of the year.
Yeah, everything feels better, happier. The sun's out. Things feel good. It was dark for a little bit there because I've been going out in the mornings trying to get that first Albie of the season. Had some shots, seen them. It just hasn't quite lined up. So it felt good to finally get that first one of the season. And I don't know, everything's better now. Going into Labor Day weekend on a high note.
So I know you're saying that it had been tough. You hadn't gotten your Albie. Some other guys had gotten them. But it's not as if you were going out there and getting skunked.
No, it's been, and part of the reason I've been going out so much is because there have been so many bonito around. And it's been this incredible bonito season that I've been fishing Cape Cod for 20 plus years. I've never seen bonito like this. There've been some good years, but nothing this big, this many bonito.
This has been, the only year I could relate to it is 2019 when there were a lot of bonito around, but they were small. Mm-hmm. This, you see a much wider range of sizes of bonito, and it's not just happening here on Cape Cod. It's in Rhode Island, it's in Long Island, it's in New Jersey. There are a ton of bonito around this year. And there's so many bonito that I've been hearing you. I heard Anthony come in the other day, came in from a morning of fishing and said, how was it? And they go, just bonito. Guys talking about them the way they talk about bluefish.
Yeah, before this year, I'd never caught a bonito on the fly rod before. And I was super excited about a month ago to get my first ever bonito on the fly rod. And since then, I've I don't know, maybe got like a dozen of them, both from boat and from the kayak. And I did get to that point of like, okay, I'm not even going to cast to the bonito anymore. I want to find the Albies. So definitely a fun way to get spoiled.
So the Atlantic bonito is one of those, we put in the hardtail category.
They're in the mackerel and tuna, that family, right? If I think I have that right, the scombrids.
That's correct, yeah. And they've got teeth. They look similar to Albies. They both have that green coloration, that kind of torpedo-shaped body. Bonito are a little bit more streamlined than Albies. Their stripes, they've got the same kind of lateral stripes, but they're straighter on a bonito. The teeth and the dorsal fin are two of the very obvious things you look at for them. And then one of the other things people say is bonito are good to eat, Albies are not good to eat. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But bonito they arrive generally earlier in the summertime. You can start hearing about them around July 4th, sometimes as early as late June. But for the most part, it's kind of a offshore shoals and lumps type of fishery. They don't always come inshore.
Yeah, a typical year here on Cape Cod, we start talking about bonito as being, there's an area off of Martha's Vineyard, and it's called the Hooter, and it's named after a buoy out there. And that's the spot, like, if you want to catch bonito, head out to the Hooter. And it's maybe 2 miles south of Martha's Vineyard?
I think it's right. It's just outside the EZ, because I know you're not allowed to target stripers at part of the Hooter there.
So about 2 to 3 miles south of Martha's Vineyard. So it's a bit of a run, but you'd go out there, and a lot of times it was trolling. You could get them casting as well, but that was where you'd go for bonito. They didn't always move inshore necessarily, and when they did move inshore, it wasn't always in big numbers. Rhode Island in recent years has tended to get stronger runs of bonito than we do here on Cape Cod. Nantucket, being a little more offshore, tended to get bonito more commonly. But they're an interesting fish that I don't think we know a whole lot about. I don't think it's easy for scientists to understand, in terms of how many bonito are in the ocean. They range all over the Atlantic. They catch them down in Florida. There's runs of them in North Carolina and off South Carolina. They're up here. Usually Cape Cod is considered kind of the northern limit, but they do also occasionally go north into the Gulf of Maine as well. So they really range over a huge area, and whether or not they appear in our area on any given season in any numbers, I think is some combination of maybe the size of the population, the water currents, the bait that's available, and maybe there's some luck and chance as well.
So I looked into some of the stock assessments not quite stock assessments, but commercial landings for bonito, to just kind of get a gauge on what's the population look like. They are an incredibly important commercial fish across the Atlantic. Like in Africa, in the Mediterranean, you see that some countries really rely on bonito as a food fish and a commercial fish. Less important over here, but I do think that the epicenter of like the bonito population in the Western Atlantic is North Carolina up to us here in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. False Albacore, which we'll talk about a little bit, they seem to be a little bit more wide ranging. Like you're going to find they're almost, I mean, they've got a global range, but Bonito, it seems like they're out here on this side of the Atlantic, really focused between North Carolina and Massachusetts, and looking at the commercial landings, knowing what years have been good years. 2019, you saw a big spike. A lot of Bonito landed here. Some really slow years in the mid 2010s, which kind of lines up with I remember not seeing them, not hearing about them quite as much. And then the last couple of years have been pretty decent. And then this year, I think we're going to see some really big numbers because it's been exceptional.
And when we saw that run in 2019, it tended to be a lot of smaller Bonito, and we thought, okay, they're going to come back bigger next year and bigger the year after that, and we're going to have big Bonito around. It didn't really happen. And so it's been tough to predict, and it's something that, again, we just kind of wait and see what the season brings. And this season, I think we got lucky, and we got a great Bonito run.
Yeah, so just a big Bonito is probably, where would you say that, what's the line for big?
I think once you get over, I would say a 6-pound fish, I'd call that a big Bonito.
I agree with that. And that year you're talking about when we had them, they were mostly like 1 to maybe 2-pound fish. Mm-hmm. This year, maybe we're not seeing a lot of 6-pound fish, but you're seeing some 4 and 5s, mm-hmm. and that's a big enough fish to take some drag. They don't fight as hard as Albies.
They definitely don't. They are a lot of fun because they school similar to Albies. They chase bait, feed on the surface a lot. They pop up, they disappear. They can be picky at times, although they tend to be less picky than Albies, I think. But yeah, you hook one. They're incredibly fast fish, but they don't seem to have the strength or the stamina, the ability to really pull drag like an Albie does. Although a wise man, it was actually you, Jimmy, once said, any fish takes drag if you loosen the drag enough.
That was in the On the Water Instagram. Somebody asked if Bonito took drag, and that was kind of my snarky answer. It's every fish takes drag, depending if you set it light enough. But no, they will take good runs if they're big enough, and I think they're very fun fish. Coming from New Jersey, they were a midsummer to late summer option for us. But again, not from the beach. They're catching them from the beach this year down there. But you would go out to places like Barnegat Ridge and some of the offshore humps, like off South Jersey, Kuma Lumps and Sea Isle Ridge and places like that, and you would either troll, fast troll with small feathers and Clark spoons were the big baits down there, or you would go and bring a 5-gallon bucket worth of spearing, or as many spearing as you could get, chum with them, bring them to the back of the boat, and that remains a really popular tactic for them for the head boats.
Yeah, it is cool to think of these fish, both Bonito and Albies. They're pelagic fish, meaning they're fish of the open oceans, that they can be miles offshore, areas that we talk about as nearshore, offshore, lumps and humps, and then can come all the way into being within range of the beach, that this one fish will range that much and cover that type of water. And these, I've got a book in front of me right now. It's called Fishes of the Gulf of Maine, and I love this book because it has lots of historical records. And we might be tempted to say, oh, this change, this is something new with Bonito. Them being around in numbers, this is a sign of climate change. That could be part of what's going on. But it's interesting to look back and see in this book what the occurrence has been over the past. In this, having historical records, I think this book came out around 1950. It's been updated many times since. There's information in here on commercial landings that says things like, for example, that in certain years, in 1919, that there were huge numbers of Bonito. Here it says 26 metric tons were landed off Cape Cod between Woods Hole and Martha's Vineyard in the year 1945. So there's a lot of this cool stuff, and what you realize is there have been times in the past. In 1876, there were 73 taken in a weir off Gloucester. So there have been times in the past where huge numbers of Bonito have shown up like this, and even going north of Cape Cod, which we are seeing to some extent this year. Cape Cod Bay has had a huge run of Bonito. They've been around Provincetown. So kind of expanding north just because there are so many of them, I think.
It's not uncommon to see the small ones in Cape Cod Bay and north of the Cape. I know people that are guys that are jigging mackerel to catch for giant bluefin tuna bait often come up with Christmas trees of the small, really small 6-inch, 7-inch Bonito. But when you see the larger 2 to 5 pound Bonito up there, that's kind of noteworthy, and that's becoming more of a common occurrence.
Definitely. And this is, by the way, the scientific name Sarda, the Atlantic Bonito. because there's a lot of confusion out there because we call Atlantic Bonito here. Some people mix them up with the name for False Albacore in the southeast, which is Bonita with an A at the end. They'll call False Albacore that. So there's some confusion. Bonito, all the other many names that they have for False Albacore. So this is the Atlantic Bonito Sarda.
So there's a bunch of different species of bonito. There's only one false albacore. There's only one little toonie, and that's got a global range. But they have in the Pacific bonito, which is Sarda something else. I don't know if they got to the Atlantic and they're like, whatever, I'm not thinking of a second name. We'll just call it Sarda. Eric Harrison, who was on our podcast a couple years ago, talked about that was one of the fish for him that really helped him, kind of get really into fishing. So fishing for the Pacific bonito there, he used a casting bubble, which is a plastic hollow bubble that you fill with water with a fly behind it. And he said that catching those from the piers and from the kayak and small boats in Southern California was really the surf fishing and the pier fishing fish that got you hooked on fishing out there.
And he still swears that for bonito on this side of the ocean as well, he calls it the splasher and fly. Fishing something like that ahead of a fly that makes a bit of a splash and allows you to fish a fly on spinning gear is the best way, in his opinion, to catch bonito. And I've seen he's been doing it this summer. He's been pretty productive with it.
It is one of my favorite ways to catch albies. I haven't caught a bonito doing it, but I've caught albies on it. And I know the fly guys like yourself kind of poo-poo it, if you're going to put a fly in front of them.
I poo-poo nothing.
You poo-poo most things. But the guys, it's not just a way to deliver a fly on a spinning rod. It's not just a get-around if you're a bad fly caster, even though I am. Not only does it present that more realistic fly, but the bubble itself acts as an attractor. So when you pop it, when you drag it, the goal is to make a big splash, and that splash mimics a feeding, pelagic fish, feeding hardtail. And I know it does because when I'm throwing it around boats or around kayaks, guys are going, oh, there's one right there. But it's just Jim's casting bubble popping along. But that gets the fish looking in that direction, and then they see your fly. So it's a great blind casting presentation if you're not seeing them on the surface. Or like the end of the day today, the fish got pretty scattered. I wished I'd had my casting bubble and fly today when what started out this morning, we launched. Should we go into the report? Should we talk about what we saw this morning?
Yeah, sure.
So I was going out thinking we were going to mainly get bonito. I was hoping to get a bonito from the kayak. I have not been out kayak fishing for bonito or albies. I've been out kayak fishing in general for a couple months. So I was hoping to get out there, get some, at least some bonito, maybe a Spanish mackerel. And if I saw an albie, all the better. So we launch, and I saw a feed pretty quickly. I think you were still pedaling out, cast into it, and bluefish. So kind of that is something that you really don't want to see. You've got your epoxy jigs are throwing small soft plastics. They can, if the blues are real thick, they can go through your albie box pretty quickly.
Which is a side topic. We won't get too far into that, but it has been the year of fewer bluefish than, I've heard from a lot of people sort of saying, maybe some complaining, some not, about not catching bluefish at all this year. And I don't know, strange to think that we've got this year where bonito are way more common than bluefish, but
that is really unusual because that is a lot of the bonito trolling strategy is to outrun bluefish. You go out to the Hooter some years or to Barnegat Ridge, and you are covered up with these 2 to 5 pound bluefish, which is like the most nuisance of nuisance bluefish sizes. You don't mind them when they're over 8 pounds. The snapper blues are cool, but when they're in that size, that's just a tackle destroying and epoxy jig stealing size.
And so it's all about troll as fast as you can so that you can outrun the bluefish, but you can still catch the bonito. I always thought it was like, well, bonito like a really fast moving prey. But one thing I have noticed from having so many bonito around right now, they don't necessarily want a fast moving lure. They actually, you can slow down that lure coming through a bonito feed, and they're pretty likely to hit it. That was really just about keeping it away from bluefish.
But like
which
you said,
isn't an issue this year.
No, the tables have really kind of turned on the bonito with them being much more abundant than the blues. So that was actually my first bluefish of the year. I felt bad being disappointed by it, but they weren't. I was looking for them in May, hoping to get some, and just it didn't really happen. There were a couple little fits and starts of bluefish runs. I know Jersey had a lackluster year this year, all the way on. Like last year, 2023, I saw drone photos from videos and things from guys like Sutton Lynch and Tim Reagan of acres of big bluefish off the south side of Long Island, South Shore of Long Island, and that just didn't happen this year. We don't want to go too far into a bluefish tangent, But anyhow, so I launched the kayak, catch that bluefish, and you decided on the location, and it's a place where you tend to have to pedal a long ways. And you've got the Old Town EPDL. I have a 10-year-old busted pedal drive of another type of kayak. So
It's a Hobie. You can name that.
okay, all right. So I've got a 10-year-old busted Hobie that, it gets me where I need to go. It's got a lot of miles on it. And for you, going 2 miles in your thing is no issue. But for me, it's like, well, I'm going to be late for work, and then you'll be then I have to answer to you. But you promised, you said it's going to be a short pedal. Don't worry about the broken pedal drive and all that. So we got there, and I catch the bluefish. I'm like, well, and then I see you buzz past looking for some distant feeds. And just like, I think you had just passed me, and things erupted. Everywhere you looked, there were fish on top. And my first thought was Bonito, because there hadn't been too many reports. We'd been hearing of Albies, but here and there. You had to go further east or further offshore to find the false albacore. So my first thought was Bonito, and then clear as day, there's that unmistakable Albie silhouette comes out of the water. You see it backlit by the rising sun, and it was pretty on from there, man. It was good.
Yeah, I went right past you because I thought, oh, he'll sit around here and play with the Bonito, but I've had enough of those. I'm going to head further offshore where I think there's going to be some good Albie feeds. I got out, not that much further than you were, and immediately saw a feed blow up that you can tell, like, okay, these are bigger, these are Albies. The ferociousness of the feed is on another level from the Bonito. So I was super excited. I got one pretty quickly on spinning gear, which then, different from a Bonito fight, it took a while to land. They are strong fish, and they even do the tuna circles at the side of the kayak, where that last kind of the last 20 to 30 yards of the fight of trying to get them in, get them to stop circling, get them up to the kayak can be tough. So I mean, it was fun though. I mean, that's why we do it.
So that lasted for about maybe 45 minutes.
It felt like while I was fighting my fish was the most ferocious feeds of the morning. When you're tied into a fish like that, it's like, oh, they're all around your kayak then, and you actually get to that like, oh, I want to horse this in and land it because I need to catch another one. But there's nothing you can do. But that feed, they seem to be everywhere. There were plenty of boats and kayakers out there, but when there's enough fish like that, everybody spreads out. Everybody was into their own fish, which was great. And and they were feeding on peanut bunkers, so small juvenile menhaden. They look to be about, I don't know, thumb size. Your thumb, not mine. And well, you got big thumbs. Mine are more like bay anchovy thumbs.
What? Don't look at my thumbs.
But they were feeding on peanut bunker coming out of the water, which is great because they spray out of the water. I don't know. It's a fun, exciting.
Really visual fishing today, but it lasted. As soon as the sun got a little bit higher above the horizon, it kind of shut down. The big feed stopped. And that feeding window, it's not always a right at first light bite. I feel like there's a lot of days. You do a ton of Albie fishing before work. It's a very convenient. One thing about our office being in Falmouth, Massachusetts, this time of year for the next 2 months, there's a great chance to go out, launch the kayak before work somewhere around here, fish for an hour and a half to 2 hours, and then come in and not be too late
My routine is I load up the night before, I get the kayak ready, I leave my house in the morning. Like this morning, I left at 5:30 a.m. dressed to kayak fish, but I bring along a change of clothes. I run down, launch off a beach or at a boat launch, go out there, fish maybe from, like today was 6 to 8. 2 hours of fishing was great. And then by 8:30, I'm here washing sand off my feet in the sink in the men's room, changing into work clothes. So it's weird. I swear one of these days when I'm on one foot washing the other in that men's room, like you're just going to hear the thud. You're going to have to find me in there knocked unconscious.
That's not going to be me.
Half naked. But it's the best to be able, I love this time of year. I love to be able to get out. I love that about kayak fishing, how fast I can get out, fish for 2 hours, get back in, be in the office. And kind of crazy that I was actually just messaging with somebody else who was out there. He's like, oh, are you still out there? I was like, no, I had to leave and run in and go to work, where I'm going to sit down and do a podcast talking about Albie fishing. I mean, it's one of those moments of like, wow, this is a cool job. But yeah, to be able to do that in the morning and get in here, and then getting back to what you were saying, the Albie feeding window, there's some spots, I think it has to do with the bait, sometimes maybe it's tide and current, where the Albies start to feed immediately as the sun breaks the horizon and there's an early morning and then it shuts off. There's other spots where they don't start really feeding, or other times a year where the sun gets a little higher and then they start to go. There's times where there's mid-afternoon feeds that go on forever. But this morning was definitely something about that early light. They had the advantage over the peanut bunker. They had them schooled up. They fed really hard, and the sun got higher, and then all of a sudden it really kind of petered off and shut down. Maybe it's turning on right now. Who knows?
It could be part of it too, and you mentioned this, is there's probably a ceiling to how much they could possibly eat. I mean, the fact that they were eating so much in such a short window, maybe it does. They digest for a little bit and then pops up in the afternoon, that comes back around, and they'll be hungry again. But I didn't feel bad about leaving today. Today was the fishing had slowed down enough that it was, some days it's really hard to tear yourself away from it.
I'm excited for tomorrow. I'm going to get back out there tomorrow morning and do it again. You going to get out there too?
I am not. I booked a head boat trip on the Francis Fleet for me and my daughter. She is 8 years old, and I feel like I kind of dropped the ball there. My first party boat trip was when I was 5. All of my early party boat trip, we never caught anything. So I don't know if I was saving her from that experience, because we did the half-day trip. Tomorrow is the classic tourist-filled half-day head boat trip. But I've got to get her indoctrinated into that side of things at some point.
That's very nice. I hope you guys have a good time out there.
Yeah, me too. I hope I catch some fish. I don't care what she does.
Family owned and operated for over 65 years, AFTCO represents unparalleled quality, performance, and reliability when it counts most. From inventing the roller guide to introducing the world's first pair of true fishing shorts, which are some of the most comfortable shorts you'll ever own, by the way. AFTCO not only delivers products proven to perform on the water, but are true leaders of conservation as well. Their pledge to protect and conserve has 10% of your AFTCO purchases going directly to supporting conservation initiatives. Beyond their fishing shorts, a couple of my personal favorites are the Barricade Elite bibs and jacket, as well as their line of Reaper sweatshirts, pullovers, and jackets. Check them out at aftco.com. AFTCO, any fish, any water.
I did pull up some false albacore facts. We already mentioned they have a worldwide distribution. They're fast. We know they're fast. The number I see thrown around for them a lot is 40 miles an hour, how fast they can swim.
Huh.
I'm very curious. There was a book, False Albacore, which I bought a couple years before I even caught one. Great book for mainly fly fishing for them. Came out in the early 2000s. And it listed all the speeds of fish. So false albacore, I remember, they were faster than bonefish, which I think they said swim up to like 30, 35 miles an hour. Faster than bluefish, swim up to 25 miles an hour. Do you know what the fastest fish in the world is?
Pacific sailfish?
Correct, yeah. So that can
Really?
swim. Yeah, oh yeah. That's right.
Oh, wow. I was just guessing, but
So
wow.
I think most people would probably guess wahoo, but it's Pacific sailfish, and they said they've clocked them at 68 miles per hour. My question for all of that is, how are you getting those measurements? Are you throwing like a radar gun on them, or how do you get a fish? How do you know what the top speed of a fish is?
I have no idea. Somebody must have measured that at some point. I don't know. You just set them up from point A to point B, see how fast they take to get there. I feel like that's something that a fisherman made up. Fisherman catches a Pacific sailfish and is like, I just caught the fastest fish in the ocean. And
Went
puts the
68
number
miles an
to it.
hour?
Yeah.
I just don't know how you'd measure it. I guess I could have Googled that before we did this podcast, but I didn't. So I'm just throwing out the numbers, the somewhat accepted and published numbers for fish speeds. But Albies, it said, was around 40 miles an hour, which is very fast. The world record is 36 pounds from Spain. For a time, it was in New Jersey. There's a lot of the line class records are actually from the Mediterranean, Italy specifically. Their scientific name, Euthanus aliteratus, translates to good little tuna in Greek, which is really funny.
That's cute.
The more widely accepted name worldwide, I know we say Bonito in Florida, Bonita in Florida, Albies, false albacore up here, but to the scientific community, they are little tunny.
Is it little tunny or little toonie? Because I've heard you say both now.
We're going to call it little tunny. Tunny? I think it's tunny.
I think it's tunny too, but little toonie is also sort of
Very cute.
Again,
Yeah, it's
cute as well.
That's
yeah.
what you would call a good little tuna. Interesting adaptation Albies have that leads to their speed is they have evolved to lose nearly all of their scales. If you cut up a bluefin tuna, you'll notice it has a lot of scales. It gets on the meat. You've got to wash them off. Albies have very few scales. They have a nearly frictionless skin that's coated in kind of their slime. That slime that we're currently smelling is all over our hands right now. That's to reduce drag. Good reason to wet your hands before you handle the Albies if you're releasing them. They can beat their tail up to 30 times per second, and that is what propels them to the assumed speeds of up to 40 miles an hour.
That's some good research, Jimmy. Nice job.
No, where I did this research on the Water Magazine. So Liam Rosati, who is a writer, he does some freelance. Every once in a while, he'll write a feature for us. And it kind of comes out of the blue. He said he's got a new piece, and it's fiction, but he weaves in some really interesting facts into that fiction. He does great research. I'll share the links to some of his stories. He did one on weakfish where I learned a ton about them. If I can just share the one, the name Squeteague for weakfish is a Narragansett name for the Narragansett tribe, and it means where the glue comes from, because the weakfish, they would take the swim bladders and turn that into glue.
Wow.
So yeah, neat little fact there. But anyhow, Liam Rosati wrote a story about false albacore that I just absolutely took all of these facts from. So albies are warm-blooded, and they have high concentrations of hemoglobin to deliver oxygen to meet the demands of their muscles.
Wow, the more you know. Thank you, Jimmy.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome. I've got more, but we won't keep going.
Now that you mention it, I'd never really thought about the fact that false albacore don't have scales. The bonito, because I've been catching bonito scales seem to get everywhere. They're tiny, looks like glitter. Got it on my face, got it on my rod. My fly rod's covered in glitter of these bonito scales. It looks like, doesn't look like I've been fishing. Looks like I've been someplace with a lot of glitter. And yeah, but albies, none of that.
There's certain fish that really shed their scales pretty readily. American shad do. You go shad fishing or herring fishing, you've been there because the scales are everywhere. Bluefish, even tuna do shed their scales. But albies, that was another one. I read that and then had to think about it, and you don't ever see albie scales. I'm sure they have some somewhere, but it sounds like they lost a lot of their scales to as an adaptation to be faster.
Now, one of the things that people often talk about, false albacore, are they good eating? Are they not good eating? It depends on who's eating them and what your personal tastes are. And I think there's even, different cultures tend to value different tastes and flavors in fish or might prefer different things. So I don't like to just say they're not good eating, they're bad eating, they have a bad taste. People eat false albacore. A lot of people eat them around the world. I've eaten them, and they definitely have a strong fishy flavor, but I've eaten them and enjoyed them.
We took some heat a couple years ago. We posted yes, you can eat albies was the recipe, but our whole message was, if you caught one that's bleeding and appears to be mortally wounded, like, you don't have to feel bad about throwing this back as crab food. You can take it home. You could actually make a meal out of it. But people were like,
because to be honest, catching albies, there's a good chance. I mean, they bleed a lot. I'm not sure, maybe that's part of what you were explaining before with the fact that they have what were you saying? They have a lot of hemoglobin and all that. So if you hook them in the mouth, a lot of times they do bleed quite a bit. Their gills are very upfront. The way they feed, the way they move so fast and inhale, especially I've seen this with a fly, you hook them in the gills sometimes. If you go out and catch a dozen albies, there's a pretty good chance that some of those you're going to know they're probably not going to survive. And I think the only reason when there's a bunch of people albie fishing, you don't see dead albies floating around is because they sink.
Yeah, they don't have a swim bladder. That's why in order to breathe, they need to keep moving. So albies, the second they stop moving, they're dead. I mean, that's true of all tuna pretty much.
So when you're albie fishing, there's a good chance you'll catch one and it's bleeding and it's not going to survive. And the whole point of this was, hey, this is a fish that you can actually throw on ice and treat well and enjoy eating.
So I remember a couple years back, you had an albie that didn't survive. I think as you were unhooking, it was deep hooked, and it was pretty clear that the fish had perished. And you brought it back, and I remember you cut it up on your desk and and made sushi rolls for the office, and just your standard seaweed wrapped rice, and then the albie as the little nugget of fish in the middle. And I did not like that one bit. It was soft. It was metallic. It was everything that you don't want in a sushi roll. So maybe that's not how you want to prepare albie. But marinated and grilled seems to be the people who go, oh, I love eating albies, always say they're marinating in teriyaki sauce. They're grilling it, which is, to be fair, one of those recipes that you
So there is a flavor and from cleaning an albie, there's a lot of really dark meat there that you have to trim away, I think, that to me is just way too strong and unpalatable. It has that kind of like cat food smell and taste to it. Once you trim away that dark stuff, what you're left with actually looks like pretty nice meat, tuna meat. And that's the part that I've eaten and enjoyed, but does have a bit of a, some people say it's like a blood taste, a metallic taste. I think Andy Nabreski described it like it's kind of like touching your tongue to a 9-volt battery. Yeah, so I mean, that's not something most people want. So you do, I think if you were just slicing it up and eating it like sashimi with nothing on it, you probably really detect that flavor. The more stuff you put on it, if you grill it, teriyaki flavors and that, you kind of cover it up. I found that poaching it, making it into a tuna salad was fantastic. It created a tuna salad that, I mean, if you're eating canned tuna salad, that has some off flavors sometimes. I mean, it's fishy flavors and all that. You put a bunch of mayonnaise and other things in it to cover it up. This poached Albie made into a tuna salad. Mayonnaise, chop some celery salts, maybe a little capers, get fancy with it. It was a delicious tuna salad. It was fantastic for that. But all right. I can tell you're not convinced. That's fine.
No, I don't. If I had an Albie die on me, I would probably use it for shark bait, which is another thing that people do.
Yeah.
They're down in Florida. I mean, they are not the sacred cattle that they are to us up here in the Northeast.
Correct.
Down in Florida, it's, people will load up the boat with Albies to use for Goliath grouper bait or shark bait or whatever. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that difference in kind of perception that people have for false albacore up here versus Florida. I think the majority of the reason that in Florida they're almost a nuisance or people don't even care about them that much is versus up here where we can't wait for Albie season. Absence makes the heart grow fonder.
Definitely some of that. They've got the opportunity to catch Albies year-round, so they're not so special. They also have the opportunity to go not very far offshore and get blackfin tuna, which are kind of a better-tasting, bigger Albie.
So that was one of the things I wrote down here, is that up here there aren't as many larger or more delicious species available. So in Florida, it goes, if I don't want to catch Albies today, I can catch grouper, I can catch snapper, I can catch king mackerel. Up here, it's like, if we don't catch Albies and the stripers aren't running, we're left with bluefish and fluke and tog. I love the Northeast. I would not want to live and fish anywhere else, but you have a lot more options in Florida that would definitely throw Albies down the rung of desirable species ladder.
And then the way they behave, even though it is the same species, even though it's actually some of the same fish, these populations are connected. There are fish that are swimming back and forth between the Southeast to New England. They behave differently in Florida. And I mean, that's up in the Northeast, and I don't understand why. They're chasing bait fish around, smaller bait. A lot of times, you want to use a light leader. They can be line shy. They can be incredibly picky. You want a lifelike fly or the right lure that really matches the bait. And down in Florida, it's like they will eat anything. They'll hit plugs. They'll, one of the ways that when people do target them or fish for them is just to start chumming off the back of a boat and putting out a chunk or anything, and you can catch them.
So while we were fishing today, and I hooked my first Albie of the season, and they're blowing up all over, and I couldn't wait to land that one so I could get pedaling back, chase down the next one, make another cast. I thought, how could I could never get bored of this. I've Albie fished in Florida twice, and within like 10 minutes, I'm like, I'm bored of this. Because it's like you said, you go there, you have a well full of the bait, live bait that's been cast netted. You throw a handful, you go to the structure, a couple miles offshore, throw it up there, and there are the Albies boiling behind the boat. You want to catch one on the fly? Go ahead. Do a roll cast into this frothing Albie feed, and you will catch your Albie on the fly. You want to catch 20 of them? Go ahead.
I wanted to check off Albie on the fly, and I never caught one. I did it in Florida, and it was just that they were in the chum slick, and the instructions were just flop the fly out there and don't move it so it looks like a piece of chum. And and then hooked it, and I was like, okay, well, this doesn't count. I still need to catch an Albie on the fly. Up here, it's chaos. It's trying to get the cast out before they disappear, get the fly in the water, move it as fast as possible, watch them ignore the fly. I mean, heart-pounding excitement. Every now and then, they do take the fly. Usually, something ends up going wrong. At least in my case, you get a knot in the line, or the line flies up and wraps around your foot or something like that. If I'm in the kayak, I snag a pedal. Occasionally, it all lines up, and you get to fight and land the Albie on the fly. It's awesome. Just not the same down there.
It isn't. So I do understand why they aren't as revered in Florida as they are up here. And it's not to say that it's not still fun to catch them and fight them down there. It's just that it's not the same experience. You don't feel, it's not as hard. And by not being as difficult, it becomes less interesting more quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Everglades Boats is an industry leader in premium offshore fishing boats. Founded in 1997 by boating industry legend and former Boston Whaler executive Bob Doherty, Everglades revolutionized the boat building industry with the invention of the ram cap process for one-piece unsinkable hulls. Respected for its renowned hull ride, Everglades builds center console and hybrid boats from 25 to 45 feet that make a statement about the status and savvy of their owner. Everglades has received numerous industry awards and achieved an unparalleled reputation for superior safety, performance, and quality. For more information about Everglades Boats, stop by your local dealer or visit evergladesboats.com. Everglades Boats, built for beyond.
Now, we talked about eating Albies. Bonito, on the other hand, people seem to all agree everybody loves Bonito. People keep Bonito. They like to eat them. I'm actually not a huge fan of eating them raw, which is, a lot of folks say they're great sashimi. They like to make poke bowls out of them. I find the flesh to be a little too soft. Not that great. My favorite way to eat Bonito, which I think is fantastic, I love it, is staking them. If you fillet them, again, they're soft, and the meat kind of doesn't really, I don't think, stays together that well. But if you make steaks out of them and you cook them with the bone, you get the flavor. You don't have to worry about taking the skin off. I love that. Grill them. You can add whatever kind of marinade sauce, something I like, a little citrus. To me, late summer, grilled Bonito steaks. It's tomato season, some nice fresh tomatoes as well. That's like one of the best eating things you can have in the Northeast.
With the bone and the skin holding it all together, it is so much better than if you go and you just straight fillet this fish and take the skin off. It doesn't have a lot of integrity to the fillet. And I've had it where caught on a head boat and it's not immediately bled and thrown into a slurry of seawater and ice. And the consistency is almost like mashed potatoes. It's not that for that reason, because of those experiences with it. I'm not crazy about Bonito. I'm not big on eating them.
And I think it's not a fish that you want to eat totally fresh that hasn't really gone. I think if you take a Bonito, you want to get it on ice right away. And I think even before you clean it, whether you're going to fillet it or steak it, get it really cold and let it be dead for a little while, and the flesh kind of firms up. If you eat it that same day even, it's going to be still soft. The longer you keep that fish, I'm not saying it's not going to be fresh, but the next day it firms up a little more. So that's, my suggestion. Keep that fish on ice for a day, really cold, cut it into steaks, throw the steaks on the grill. To me, there's nothing better.
All right. I will try that. Hopefully I will have a chance to catch a Bonito before they all move out. But one thing we noticed today, it had been Bonito City where we were. People were going, you were tired of them. You never wanted to catch another Bonito again. You'd caught so many. But today we go out there and we're seeing tons of Albies, very few Bonito. I did hear of a couple caught. Patrick Washburn who was our design manager here, or one of our designers here, fished from shore and he got a Bonito, but he did see some Albies. But I've heard this in the past that Albies come in and they are so fast and so aggressive that they kind of outcompete the Bonito, and the Bonito push off to places where the Albies aren't.
Yeah, and that's the typical pattern here. It seems like the Bonito push off, and then sometimes later, as the Albies start to leave, the Bonito will actually come back in, and you'll start to get more Bonito a little later. I have to imagine, though, with so many Bonito around, we're probably still going to be catching them. They'll be mixed in and around the Albies for some time to come. The other species you mentioned that's been around with the Bonito is Spanish mackerel. We don't always necessarily see Spanish mackerel up in these waters. I'd say Cape Cod is really the northernmost part of their range. We look at them as a visitor that doesn't show up every year, especially this far north. A little, more common, I think, down toward New Jersey to get them to show up down there. But it does seem like the trend maybe over the last decade plus has been a more regular showing of Spanish mackerel up here. And it also seems like it lines up with a good Bonito year. When we have Bonito around, you tend to see more Spanish mackerel.
I'll agree with that. Yeah, I remember there were days, I think of that 2019 year, when we would go out and we wouldn't see the Bonito, but everywhere you look, the Spanish mackerel have a very distinctive jump. Those fast, warm water mackerels in general kind of have this move where it's like a perfect rainbow. They come out of the water in this arc, and then they go back in head first. And that's how I saw Spanish mackerel do that this morning. But that's how you know they're around. They don't fight as hard as the Bonito or Albie, not by a long shot. I don't think they fight as hard as bluefish, but they're beautiful fish, very cool, and it's a brief window to catch them. It's been a good year for them in Long Island Sound. And that's something that over the last, like you said, maybe decade, maybe 5 years, they're seeing more of them in Long Island Sound. They get them before they get the Albies. It seems like the Spanish mackerel, whatever their migration route is, the Albies seem to hit Cape Cod first when they move north. You know, you'll see them off New Jersey, but in southern New England, they hit Cape Cod first, and then it seems like they move west. They spread west from eastern part of the Cape. So wherever they're coming from, whether it's dead south from the Gulf Stream and the canyons, or it's a bit from the east, their movement in the fall seems to be westward.
Mm-hmm. And I'll say also, since we're talking about eating all these fish, I think Spanish mackerel are delicious, and I think they're fantastic raw. So to me, if I'm going to do sashimi or sushi rolls, fresh, iced down Spanish mackerel to me is fantastic. Much firmer texture than a bonito, and I don't know what it is, but to me, it has a delicious taste.
Is it shibi? Is that the mackerel sashimi? There's a preparation that it's almost brined, or...
There is a Japanese preparation of mackerel that I know Andy Nabreski did for us once. It was something like a pickling or a brining. We'll have to add a link to it in the description of this podcast, because I remember him doing it, and it was fantastic. How's the research going? You able to find it there by Googling?
I am not fast. Whoever Joe Rogan's guy is, you got to get him if we want to get this quick research. I'm also my default search engine's Bing, so I'm out of luck.
So Spanish mackerel, delicious. You kind of described the way they move in. It seems like a lot of these fish species, especially Albies, because everybody's talking about them, and we're hearing constantly of what is the latest, where have they shown up, where have they not. They definitely move in from offshore. And they also seem to move, it seems like on Cape Cod, they come in from maybe toward the east. So mid-Cape toward the eastern parts of Cape Cod, they kind of show up there first and then push west.
Based on where they land, I always had the suspicion they moved through Muskeget Channel, which is the channel between Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. If you were going to draw like a heat map of how the Albies move through, I always pictured it as like them coming up through Muskeget. Some go east, some go west, and it just kind of spreads from there. Now, I'm sure they're coming from all sides of the islands, but based on where they generally show up on the south side of Cape Cod. Now, Buzzards Bay seems to get its own little push.
Yeah, and it seems also like State Beach on Martha's Vineyard, which is facing Muskeget Channel, basically. A lot of times that's one of the first spots. Hyannis in that area, which is a little more mid-Cape east, tends to get them before Falmouth, which is a little more west. Buzzards Bay always gets them after other places. But you also hear about them moving up around the same time that you'll hear them around the Elizabeth Islands. You'll hear them showing up in Rhode Island. And so there must be some that come from offshore areas there and move north. You also see them before they show up inshore. They'll start to show up in offshore catches. Folks who are off jigging for bluefin tuna, which I know you've seen out there. So miles and miles south of Block Island, pretty much, offshore grounds, 180 feet of water maybe, you're finding huge schools of false albacore before they've moved in to the inshore waters out there.
And that is somewhere where, the way you're feeling about the bonito now, where you'd rather catch the Albies than the bonito, when you're offshore and you're finding the Albies there mixed in with the bluefin, you don't want to be tied up with an Albie out there. That was a really fun, but at times frustrating trip with Chris. We did 2 of them, 2 in a row. And man, you could not punch a jig through the Albies to get to the tuna that you knew were below. And it's not like a fish where you can just beat it quickly. I mean, they would get up, and these were big Albies, 10, 15 pounds. Even on the tuna jigging tackle, they would get about 10 feet below the boat, do those frantic circles. And you're like, oh my God, like you're looking, here comes a bunch of tuna marks under the boat, and you're dealing with an Albie. And inshore, if we'd caught them right outside Falmouth Harbor when we left that day, we would have been absolutely thrilled. But 40 miles south, we were not happy, none too pleased to see the Albies out there.
Yeah, so much of fishing is context.
Oh,
yeah, it's a little wisdom.
Buzzards Bay Yacht Sales knows that a great boat dealer is as important as a great boat. Why? Because new or used, you're buying a boat with 100 different systems and components that need tuning, training, troubleshooting, and sometimes repair. While most boat dealers are your best friend only until the sale is closed, Buzzards Bay Yacht Sales has developed a bulletproof reputation for building long-term relationships with their customers. Before, during, and most importantly, after the sale. Go ahead, ask around. We challenge you to find anyone who has anything but great things to say about Tom O'Toole and his team. With 6 locations from Freeport, Maine to Jupiter, Florida, including Marblehead, Massachusetts, and 3 offices on Cape Cod, Buzzards Bay Yacht Sales is committed to providing the best possible product, customer service, and support for both recreational boaters and passionate sport fishermen. It's true, who you buy from is as important as what you buy. Visit buzzardsbayyacht.com today.
One of the other species I want to talk about, and I haven't caught one this year, haven't caught one in a couple years, is king mackerel here in the Northeast. Now, we do get runs occasionally of good numbers of king mackerel, and sometimes they're confused with Spanish mackerel because a juvenile king mackerel does share those same yellow spots that a king mackerel does. As they grow bigger, they lose those spots, and they take on that kind of more silvery, shimmery look. The best way to tell the difference between a king mackerel and a Spanish mackerel is you look at the lateral line. The king mackerel has it's a very distinctive lateral line on both species. You can see it. King mackerel's has a very sharp dip, and the Spanish mackerel's is more of a slow arc down the body of the fish. But some years, the king mackerel are here in big numbers, and there are some get not Florida-sized. You're not going to see a 20-pounder, although a couple, I think it was last year or the year before, somebody caught the new state record in New Jersey that was, I think, in the 30-pound range. I'll look that up. It might even be bigger than that. Most years, 10-pounder, you're doing something. I think the state record was caught the last good king mackerel year we had, really good king mackerel year. A kid caught it was like a 12-year-old kid caught this Massachusetts state record, and I want to say that was 10 or 11 pounds. But it was a 34, 35-inch fish. Really cool catch up here. And when they're around, the best way to get them is trolling. They were here with Eric Harrison, was the one who dialed it in one year when they were off the south side of the Cape, and he found a good casting bite for them. He would just sit on these schools of peanut bunker and keep casting, and because the king macs would come ripping through them once in a while, and you would catch pretty reliably, 28 to 30-inch king mackerel. So that is something that happens some years, not this year. I think I saw one this year in early August, but it could have been a Spanish mackerel too. It was far enough out that I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, it seems almost every year you hear of at least one or two caught locally. Someone sends in a picture and says, hey, look at this, I caught, this is a big mackerel, help me identify it, or something like that. But it's much rarer that we get these runs. I can think of maybe over the last 20 years, there have been 2 or 3 years where we had really big numbers of them, and really only one year where you could target them casting to them. They were in particular areas where they were schooled up and you could throw lures, and we had some spots where you were catching 5 or 6 in one trip out. It'll be interesting to see if that ever happens again.
We had it pretty dialed that one year where we were going out, and I was trolling small minnow plugs, but you had to endure. I was in a kayak, so there's no outrunning bluefish. I caught so many 2 to 3 pound bluefish, but you had just enough where it would be the king mackerel would take it and just screech off for the horizon. That was worth losing a few lures to the blues. I looked up the New Jersey state record. I was about half the actual amount. I said 30 pounds. The record was 67 pounds. And that was a great story. I remember we ran a story on that in the magazine a couple years ago. It was a father and son team. Dominic Rosella, they were fishing out of Manasquan Inlet. They were going to go tuna fishing. I think one of their outboards went down. They had some engine troubles and were limping back in. And they said, just for the heck of it, since we're going this speed and we've got to go all the way in, let's throw the rods out. So their boat troubles ended up being resulting in a state record. So pretty cool story there.
And it's interesting. I don't remember the scientific term for it. I think there is a scientific term. Most fish species, if you think about it, the juveniles, you have more juveniles, they tend to be the ones that disperse. And so king mackerel, for example, what we're seeing up here when we get king mackerel runs on Cape Cod, it's juvenile, smaller fish that come up this way. And that's pretty much the way it is for most fish species. There are some, though, where it's the older, adult, mature individuals that tend to stray and roam. And I think about the two that come to mind that we see up here, tarpon. You don't hear about we had a run of 10-pound tarpon this year. No, it's a single solitary 6-footer, 5-footer that shows up in somebody's catch. Yeah, Long Island or on Cape Cod, which there has been one. This year was caught in Rhode Island. There was a surfcaster who reported one. I think it was last year that a shark fisherman on the beach of Cape Cod caught a big tarpon. And then the other fish species is Cubera snapper, where it's the largest Cubera snapper that roam. And so you don't really hear about anyone catching small Cubera snapper, but every now and then there's a 40 or 50-pound Cubera that shows up, either a recreational fisherman, like I remember there was a surfcaster in New Jersey who got one a little while back. Yeah. There's a story of one that was caught in the Cape Cod Canal that was around that size, big Cubera snapper, and commercial fishermen who are off netting tend to report them now and then. this big tropical snapper, 40, 50 pounds that shows up here. That's one of those fish that, I mean, I feel like that would be the ultimate unicorn to catch up in the Northeast.
Just knowing that somebody once caught one in the Cape Cod Canal. You know, if you ever hook something that you lose or a mysterious bite off, that's you always kind of wonder about that. What weird thing is going to be in there. One of the cool Cubera stories in recent years was the spear fisherman who saw one. He said he was diving spearfishing off Block Island for striped bass. I want to say 5 or 6 years ago now, and he said he saw the Cubera snap. You know, it stood out like a sore thumb. You know, this bright. I don't think it would look red that deep because red gets filtered out of the water column, the light spectrum there. But clearly not a striper. He managed to spear it and brought it to the surface, and that was a good sized fish. So that would be. I'd like to catch a Cubera snapper anywhere. I know.
Oh, absolutely.
They are such cool fish. I hooked one in Panama when I did a kayak trip to Panama. We talked about that in a previous podcast. Hooked one on live. It looked like an Albie. It might have been a bullet tuna we were using for bait down there when you could catch them. And the fish just got me right into the reef, and there was no moving it. But that seems to be that's what they do. You know, they get right back to the structure. Very strong, powerful fish, but a pure needle in a haystack up here.
Yeah, but that's, again, one of the best times about this part of year. We get new fish, we get visitors, we get the summer visitors that we can kind of expect. Every year's different in terms of the numbers. Every year's a little different in terms of what other species may or may not show up in your catch. And that's part of the excitement of being up here. Like you said earlier, you could be in Florida where you get tons of fish, you can catch year round and everything's great. That would get boring. We like being in the Northeast. Things stay interesting. It's always a challenge. And you start to get that feeling also this time of year. The end of the season is in sight. The end of the real saltwater season. November's going to be here before we know it. So I don't know. It gets you out of bed this time of year. You get out of bed a little easier and get out there because you want to make the most of the fishing.